Last week we talked about Pentecost, about what it means that God pours out the Spirit on people, not on one charismatic leader, while everyone else is watching, on the sons and the daughters, the children, on the young and the old, on the servants, men and women, on people who have been listened to their whole lives and people who have been systematically ignored. And when the Spirit is poured out, people dream, people see, people speak. So he said the future doesn't belong to the heroes. The future belongs to Spirit-filled people willing to dream, to see, to speak, and to build something together. This week we take the next step, because if the Spirit gives vision, we have to ask an uncomfortable question that I don't think we ask often enough. What are visions actually for? Are they a way to check out? Are they a private spiritual experience that makes us feel better while everything stays exactly the same? Are they fantasies we hold on to because the real world is too painful to look directly at? Or are visions something more dangerous than that? Here's what I want to say today, and I want to say it plainly. A vision is not an escape from reality. A vision is God's interruption of the reality Empire told us was final. And to understand what that means, we have to go to Jeremiah, to one of the strangest and most demanding letters in all of Scripture. I'm your host, Pastor Andrew Shipley. This is the Missiongathering Christian Church Disciples Across Christ podcast. And this is Imaginary Resistance Episode 2. Let's go. So Jeremiah 20, or Jeremiah 29, is a letter written to people in exile. These are people who've been displaced violently against their will. From everything that oriented their lives, they watched their world collapse. They were carried to Babylon, the capital of the empire that had destroyed them. They are grieving, they're disoriented, they're furious, exhausted, and they're asking the questions that every exiled person eventually asks. How long? Then after they ask how long, they ask the other question is, what does faithfulness even look like when the world you knew is gone and no one is coming to put it back together? And there were prophets. There were always prophets who were willing to give them the answer they wanted to hear. Those who would tell them, don't settle in, don't build anything here, don't plant anything, don't even unpack, don't invest in this place, because this will all be over soon. People who said, someone is coming to rescue you, a hero will come and save us. You won't have to learn how to live here. And I understand why that message sells. Heck, I'd buy into that message now for certain things. When you're in exile, when everything seems like it's falling apart, when the pain is real and the systems are crushing and nothing is what it's supposed to be, you want somebody to tell you that the nightmare will end before breakfast. You want the fast rescue. You want the parachute. But Jeremiah sends a different word. Not a comfortable word. Not a sentimental word. Not a word that papers over the pain of what happened. God says through Jeremiah, build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Create families. Increase there. Do not dwindle. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile and pray to the Lord for it. Because your future is connected to its welfare. Friends, that's a strange word. And we need to stay inside how strange it is for a minute. God does not say that Babylon is good, that Babylon is the New Jerusalem. God does not say exile is fine. God doesn't say to forget Jerusalem or to make peace with oppression or to stop grieving what you've lost. God says in the middle of a place you didn't choose, under the shadow of an empire you didn't consent to, build life, plant gardens, seek welfare, do not disappear, do not dwindle. Do not let exile turn you into ghosts. That is not resignation. That's resistance. The empire wanted exile to produce despair. Wants the displaced to feel so disoriented that they can no longer imagine a future that doesn't run through Babylonian terms. But Jeremiah from Egypt is writing them directly against that project. God tells you the future is not defined by Babylon's imagination of you. Your life is not over because empire says it's over. God says plant something, eat, harvest, fall in love, live. So when we're talking about visions, there's a kind of imagination that helps us escape. And honestly, sometimes we need that kind of imagination, don't we? We need stories and art and rest and beauty, and we need our nervous systems to stop bracing long enough to remember what it feels like to be fully human. I'm not against rest, and I'm not against small mercies that help people survive hard seasons, but there's a difference between rest and disappearance. There's a difference between imagination that restores us for love, for the fight, and imagination that excuses us from that love or that fight. There's a difference between dreaming and checking out, isn't there? Escapist imagination says, this place is too broken, so I don't owe it anything. This city is too complicated, so I won't invest in it. This church and its people are too messy, so I'll only critique it from a safe distance. This family is too painful, so I'll never risk trying to repair anything. This world is too far gone. I'll just protect what's mine and wait for someone else to figure it out. You see, escapist imagination disappears, but prophetic imagination, it plans. Prophetic imagination doesn't deny how bad things are. It doesn't pretend that Babylon is Jerusalem. It doesn't call exile home in a way that erases grief. But it says, even here, God can grow life. Even here, we can build structures of care. Even here, we can make tables. Even here, we can protect our children. Even here, we can tell the truth. Even here, we can refuse to dwindle. Walter Brueggemann, who spent his career arguing that prophets were not doomsday preachers, but imagination workers. Think about that. People keeping alive the picture of the world that empire was trying to kill. Put it this way. It is the vocation of the prophet to keep alive the ministry of imagination, to keep conjuring and purposing future alternatives to the single one the king wants to urge as the only thinkable one. That's from his book, The Prophetic Imagination. That is what Jeremiah is doing. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, wants to have the exiles believe that there is no future outside of Babylonian terms, to assimilate them. Jeremiah writes a letter and says it's plain, plant a garden, which is, when you sit with it, a deeply subversive act, because a garden is a claim about the future. You don't plant a garden if you believe there's no tomorrow worth cultivating. You don't put seeds in the ground if you believe that empire has the final word on what is possible. Fritz Fanon wrote that colonialism doesn't just take land, it takes time. It takes the futurity. It makes the colonized feel that the only available future is the one empire is offering. That there's no imaginable life outside of the terms of the dominant culture and the terms that it's set. Jeremiah's pushing back against that exactly. And Fanon's fuller description of what empire does is to the past is clarifying here, right? Colonialism is not satisfied with merely holding people in its grip and emptying the native's brain of all form and content. By a kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of the oppressed people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys that. That's Frantz, Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. When Fanon says the empire destroys the past, He means it destroys the story you tell about who you are and where you came from, which is also a way of destroying the future. Because you cannot build towards something if you don't know what you're building from, or if you're confused about what you're building from. The garden in Jeremiah is simultaneously an act of memory and futurity. We are a people who plant. We are a people who eat. We are a people who have a tomorrow. That is what prophetic imagination looks like, not a vision that floats above the world, but a vision with dirt under its fingernails. Hope that knows where the shovel is, because gardens don't grow because someone had a beautiful feeling about it. Gardens grow because someone prepares the soil, plants the seeds, waters the ground, pulls the weeds, protects the vulnerable, waits through the seasons that feel endless, and then shares the harvest. Jeremiah doesn't tell the people to feel hopeful, right? He gives them practices. He doesn't tell them just to have a feeling. He tells them to build houses, to plant gardens, create families, seek welfare, pray. That matters enormously, because visions without structures, they just become slogans. And slogans are one of the primary ways that well-meaning communities avoid actually ever doing anything. You know, here in our space, we say we believe in community. But when we say that, we need to challenge ourselves every time. Where are the structures that help people actually belong and not just attend? We say we believe in justice, but where are the practices that repair harm rather than just naming it? We say we believe in hospitality, but where are the actual tables, the actual schedules, the actual budgets, the actual people showing up week after week after week? We say we believe no one should be alone, but where are the structures that notice when somebody disappears? And the structures that go looking for them? Kwok, Pui-lan, one of the foremost postcolonial feminist theologians working today, argues that the church has often done theology from inside the dominant culture without realizing it, producing a kind of imagination that is comfortable to the powerful and disorienting to everyone else. The corrective, she says, is not just better ideas, but different structures, different tables, different voices shaping the room. She writes, to imagine means to discern that something is not fitting, to search for new images, and arrive at a new pattern of meaning and interpretation. Notice what she's saying. Imagination begins with noticing that something is not fitting. That is a structural claim, not a just spiritual one. If the room isn't working for people, if the table keeps seating the same people in the same seats while others wait outside, then the vision has to become a renovation. Imagination organized, imagination with calendars, imagination with childcare, imagination with shared money, imagination with trained facilitators and conflict practices and soup pots and prayer meetings and public witness. And friends, this is one of the hardest things for churches to do, because we're almost always better at inspiration than we are at infrastructure. Better at naming values than building practices, better at saying community rather than creating the actual conditions where lonely people are genuinely known. Better at preaching justice than redistributing power, better at innovating and better at inviting marginalized people into the room rather than changing the room so that they can rest and breathe once they're in it. Jeremiah doesn't give the exiles a vision board. He gives them a way of life. Build, plant, eat, multiply, seek, pray. The move from vision to structure. That is the central question for this whole series. What do we keep saying we value that we haven't built structures to support? Because vision without structure can become a comfortable way to avoid responsibility. But a vision with structure becomes a place where people can actually live and move and find their being. So now we have to deal with the complicated part. Because God says through Jeremiah to seek the welfare of the city I've sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because your future depends on its welfare. And I want to be honest, that this verse has been weaponized. It's been used to tell oppressed people to be quiet, to assimilate, to be good citizens, to make the empire more comfortable, to be useful and grateful, and not to ask too many questions about why things are arranged the way they are. Don't challenge the system, just help it run a little more smoothly. But that's not what Jeremiah is doing. Jeremiah is not telling the exiles to worship Babylon, to bow down before Nebuchadnezzar. He's not telling them to forget who they are or to bless the violence or to confuse empire with the kingdom of God. He's telling them something more, and something more demanding than that. He's saying that your life is bound up with the life around you. That even in exile, you cannot live as though you're entirely unrelated to your neighbors. This is not a moment of assimilation. This is a moment of realizing there's interdependence between Babylonian and exiled. The Hebrew word translated as welfare, right? Hebrew word here is shalom. Seek the shalom of the city. And shalom is not a word that means peace and quiet or the absence of conflict or everyone keeping their heads down. Shalom means wholeness. It means repair, the conditions under which all people can actually flourish. He's saying seek that, not because Babylon is innocent, not because empire deserves your loyalty, but because your neighbors are there. Children are there, workers are there, servants are there, the poor are there, the sick are there, the lonely are there. And your life is tangled up with theirs, whether you or they acknowledge it or not. Mitri Raheb, the Palestinian liberation theologian who's done theology literally under military occupation and genocide in Bethlehem, makes a distinction that's clarifying here. He distinguishes between theological software that justifies empire and theological software that resists it, between the theology that tells you God is on the side of whoever has the most power and the theology that refuses to claim entirely. Seeking shalom in Raheb's framework is always a form of resistance because empire needs people divided and isolated and competing against each other for the scraps. Shalom is inherently anti-imperial, anti-settler colonial. It insists on the wholeness of everyone, which empire cannot afford because empire runs on hierarchy and disposability. Seeking the welfare of the city means refusing the lie that we can be whole while our neighbors are disposable. Or it means refusing the fantasy that we can build private safety inside public collapse. It means refusing to say that as long as my family's okay, the neighborhood can burn. Freire put it plainly, right? You cannot seek the liberation of some while leaving others behind, because liberation is not a private transaction, right? No one liberates himself by his own efforts alone. Neither is he liberated by others. Human beings are liberated themselves in communion with each other. It's from Pedagogy of the Oppressed. That's what seeking the shalom of the city looks like. Not saving the city, not arriving as heroes with all the answers, but entering in the life of the city as people who know our own survival is tied to the survival of others. That's love organized in public. That's the mission. And here's something I don't want to skip over. I know we've been talking for a minute, but I don't want to skip over this because I think skipping it would be kind of dishonesty on its own, right? Jeremiah's not writing to a people whose lives are going well. He's writing to a people in exile, right? People who've lost things that cannot quickly be repaired, which means the word to build and plant does not bypass that grief. It does not say, don't be sad, everything happens for a reason, or at least you're still alive, or whatever platitudes you want to throw in there. It doesn't say stay positive. It lives alongside the grief, not in place of it. You see, the Bible has extensive room for lament, for exile songs sung by rivers in Babylon, for people weeping because they remember what they had and cannot stop remembering. The Bible has room for anger and honest acknowledgement that some things have genuinely been lost. Brueggemann calls this the prophetic task of grief, the willingness to name endings rather than push past them into a forced hope that hasn't been earned. He writes that compassion constitutes a radical form of criticism because it announces that the hurt is to be taken seriously, that the hurt is not to be accepted as normal and natural, but as an abnormal, unacceptable condition for humanness. That's a profound claim. Grief, named honestly in public, is itself a form of resistance. It refuses to normalize what should not be normal. We live in a time when a lot of people are grieving futures they thought that they would have, that their children would have. They're grieving the future they thought their kids would inherit, right? The stability they thought adulthood would bring, the church they thought it would exist until they died, the democracy they thought was more durable, the climate they thought would hold, the bodies that changed underneath them, the relationships that ended, the homes that were lost, the communities that were fractured, faith that no longer fits the container it came in. That grief is real, and it deserves to be named rather than managed. Fanon's framework is useful here, even though he's not writing as a theologian. He argues that the colonized must go through a stage of honest confrontation with the full weight of what has been done. No denial, no minimizing, before genuine liberation becomes possible. You cannot build from a foundation of unacknowledged grief. The grief has to be named, felt, and sat with. And then you build. Not instead of grieving, but through it. Fanon said each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission. They must fulfill it or betray it. That is a word for community in difficult season. What is our mission in this particular moment of obscurity? Not the mission we inherited unchanged. Not the mission that made sense in a different cultural moment. Not the mission that belongs to generations past, but the mission that belongs to this generation, in this place, under these conditions, with this grief and this particular specific hope. Grief without building becomes despair, but building without grief becomes denial. But grief and building together, that is what the tradition has always called holy resistance. So what are visions for? They're not escapes. They're not spiritual insurance policies. They're not fantasies that free us from responsibility. They're not private property of gifted individuals who hear from God while everyone else just follows along. Visions are how God gives us sight inside conditions designed to make us stop seeing. Conditions designed to make us believe that empire's version of reality is the only version on offer, the only future available, the only story worth telling. The exiles wanted a quick rescue. God gave them a long obedience. Build houses, plant gardens, eat, harvest. Seek the shalom of the city. Pray, don't dwindle, don't disappear. Don't let empire be the only architect of your future. That leaves us asking, where do we need to build houses of belonging? Where do we need to plant gardens of care? Where do we need to stop waiting for a hero and start organizing the vision the Spirit has already given us? Where do we need hope with roots? Where do we need courage with hands? Where do we need imagination with a budget, a calendar, a meal train, a shared table, a phone call, a repair process, a prayer, a plan. Kwok Pui-lan says postcolonial imagination begins with discerning that something is not fitting. That's where we start, friends. Something is not fitting. The current arrangements are not good enough. The empire's version of the future is not the only one at the table. And the God of Jeremiah, the God who writes letters to exile, who doesn't abandon people in Babylon, who refuses to let despair be the only realistic option in the room, that God is still speaking today, still pouring out the Spirit today, still asking communities like this one to plant something in the soil that empire said was dead. So, friends, may we receive visions that do not float away from the world. Visions with dirt under their fingernails. Visions that become shelter and gardens and tables and repair and justice and breath. May we become the people we have been waiting for, not because we are exceptional, but because the Spirit has already been poured out and the seeds are already in our hands and the city is already waiting for someone to seek its shalom. So even now, build, plant, eat, seek, pray. Do not dwindle. Thanks for being here. If this episode found you somewhere real, share it with someone who needs permission to stop waiting and start planting. Find us at missiongathering.com. All the links are in the show notes. Next week's episode 3, Radical Self-Love as Resistance. We'll see you then.